The airport buzzed with the usual chaos. Passengers rushing to their gates, flight announcements crackling over the speakers, and the scent of fresh coffee mixing with the faint smell of jet fuel. Among the travelers, an elderly black woman walked slowly through the terminal, her steps careful but steady. She clutched her handbag close, her face calm despite the hurried world around her. She had seen much in her lifetime, and not much could shake her anymore. But today, she was about to face something she never expected. She had arrived early for her flight, eager to visit her grandchildren, whom she had not seen in months. Her husband, a man of quiet power and influence, had made sure she had the best ticket available, first class as always. He insisted on it. "You deserve the best," he always told her. But she never cared for luxury, only for comfort and respect. As she reached the check-in counter, she politely handed her boarding pass to the flight attendant standing at the gate. The young woman barely glanced at her before sighing in impatience. "This is the first-class line," the attendant said flatly, eyeing the elderly woman's modest attire. "Yes, I know," the older woman responded, her voice gentle but firm. The flight attendant pursed her lips, clearly doubtful. She took the ticket with exaggerated reluctance and scanned it. The machine beeped, confirming the woman's first-class status. The attendant's face tightened. There was no mistake. This woman was supposed to be here. Still, instead of apologizing, she let out an irritated sigh. "Fine," she muttered under her breath. "Just hurry up." The elderly woman didn't react, only giving a small nod as she moved forward. She had encountered attitudes like this before. She had long stopped wasting energy on people who chose to see her as less than she was. As she stepped onto the plane, she walked toward her seat near the front. The plush, spacious first-class cabin was already filling up with well-dressed passengers. She reached for the overhead bin to place her handbag inside, but before she could, the same flight attendant appeared beside her. "You can't put that there," the woman snapped, her tone sharp. "Economy passengers have to store their bags. In the back." The elderly woman blinked, momentarily thrown off. "I am a first-class passenger," she reminded her. The flight attendant rolled her eyes. "I need to see your ticket again." A few heads turned as nearby passengers overheard. Some exchanged glances, but no one spoke up. The elderly woman took a slow breath and handed over her boarding pass once more. The attendant snatched it, glancing at it quickly. Again, the confirmation was clear. First class. Yet, instead of backing down, she handed it back with a forced smile. "Must have been some kind of mix-up," she muttered, then added under her breath, "Not sure how." The elderly woman took her seat, settling in quietly. She had learned long ago that some battles were not worth fighting, but something about this felt different. She could feel the eyes on her, the weight of unspoken words from those around her. Just as she began to relax, the flight attendant returned, this time holding a glass of water. Without warning, she placed it roughly on the tray table, causing it to spill slightly. "You should be more careful," she said, her voice laced with fake concern. The elderly woman sighed, dabbing at the small spill with a napkin. She refused to let this woman ruin her journey. But then, the flight attendant did something that made the entire first-class cabin gasp. With an air of frustration, she reached down and gripped the elderly woman's arm. "Listen, lady," she said under her breath, her tone dripping with annoyance. "People like you usually sit in the back. Maybe you should—" The slap came so quickly, so unexpectedly, that for a moment everything froze. The sharp crack echoed through the cabin, and every passenger within earshot turned to stare. The elderly woman's head tilted slightly from the impact, but she did not react with shock or fear. Instead, she slowly turned her gaze toward the flight attendant, her expression unreadable. At that moment, the flight crew had no idea who they had just humiliated. The woman sitting quietly in seat 2A was not just any passenger. And the man who would be waiting for her at her destination was not just any husband. Somewhere in an executive office, a phone would soon ring, And when it did, everything would change. But for now, the silence inside the cabin was heavy, thick with tension. The flight attendant's face was frozen, realizing too late that she had crossed a line she could never undo. And the elderly woman? She simply sat there, her hands folded neatly in her lap, waiting, because she knew the storm that was coming, and it was going to be bigger than anyone on that plane could ever imagine. The tension in the first-class cabin was thick. The flight attendant stood frozen, her hand still hovering slightly in the air, as if even she could not believe what she had just done. A few passengers gasped. Others looked away, pretending they had not seen what had just happened. But everyone felt the weight of it. The elderly woman did not flinch. She sat still, her face unreadable, her hands gently resting on her lap. She had been through too much in life to react impulsively. She had faced situations far worse than this, but deep down, she knew this was different. This was not just an act of disrespect. This was something bigger. The flight attendant quickly looked around, her face turning pale. Maybe she realized that she had gone too far. Maybe she thought no one would care, but the silence that followed was louder than any outburst could have been. She swallowed hard and forced a nervous smile, as if hoping to pretend that nothing had happened. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down," she said, trying to regain control of the moment. A few passengers frowned at her words. Calm down? The elderly woman had done nothing but sit in her seat. Still, the older woman remained silent. She slowly lifted a napkin and wiped the side of her face where the slap had landed, not out of pain, but simply to erase the moment, as if it had never happened. Then she exhaled softly and turned her head, gazing out the window. The clouds stretched across the sky like endless waves, peaceful and undisturbed. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably. She glanced toward the other crew members for support, but none of them spoke. One of them, a younger man, looked like he wanted to say something but hesitated. Instead, he quickly busied himself with adjusting the overhead compartments, pretending he had not seen anything. A few rows away, a businessman with silver hair and a well-tailored suit watched the scene carefully. His sharp eyes flickered between the elderly woman and the flight attendant. He reached for his phone, slowly typing a message before tucking it away. A woman in the aisle seat of the next row cleared her throat. She had been watching everything from the moment the elderly woman had stepped onto the plane. She was younger, maybe in her late 30s, dressed in business casual attire and clearly uncomfortable with what had just happened. "That was unnecessary," she muttered, just loud enough for the flight attendant to hear. The flight attendant's head snapped toward her. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying a slight edge. The woman hesitated, but then straightened her shoulders. "I said that was unnecessary. She was just sitting there." The flight attendant narrowed her eyes. "This is a first-class cabin. We have to maintain order." "Order?" The businessman across the aisle suddenly spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I did not realize order included slapping passengers." A murmur rippled through the surrounding seats. The flight attendant's face flushed. She opened her mouth as if to defend herself, but before she could say anything, a voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We will be departing shortly. Please take your seats and prepare for takeoff." The flight attendant took a step back, regaining some of her composure. She shot one last glance at the elderly woman before turning sharply and walking toward the front of the cabin. The passengers slowly settled back into their seats, but the energy in the air had shifted. The mood was no longer one of quiet luxury. Now there was an underlying tension, an awareness that something had just happened that should not have. The elderly woman remained still. Her fingers gently traced the edge of her handbag. Inside, her phone was silent, but she knew that soon it would ring, and when it did, everything would change. Her husband had always told her to call him if she ever needed anything. He was a man who solved problems quickly and efficiently. But she had never been one to complain. She had lived a long life filled with moments like this, and yet, this time, she felt something stir deep inside her, something that told her this moment would not pass quietly. A few minutes later, the plane began taxiing down the runway. The hum of the engines vibrated through the floor, steady and powerful. Passengers adjusted their seatbelts, some already lost in their books or devices. But the businessman kept watching. So did the woman in the aisle seat. As the aircraft lifted into the sky, the elderly woman closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about the life she had lived, the battles she had fought, and the quiet strength she had carried for so long. She thought about the world her grandchildren were growing up in. Then she reached into her handbag, pulled out her phone, and sent a single text. It was only a few words, short, direct, but those words would set everything into motion. And by the time the plane landed, the flight attendant would realize that she had made the biggest mistake of her career. The steady hum of the engines filled the cabin, but the tension among the passengers was impossible to ignore. Some whispered among themselves, stealing glances at the elderly woman. Others pretended to be lost in their books or screens, but their body language betrayed them. They had all seen what happened. They had all felt the shift in the air. The elderly woman sat calmly, her expression unreadable, but inside she could still feel the lingering sting of the slap. Not from the physical impact, no, that had faded quickly. It was something deeper, something heavier. A lifetime of moments like this, of being underestimated, disrespected, dismissed. But this time, things were different. She was not just any woman, and her husband was not just any man. Her phone sat quietly in her lap, face down, waiting. She knew it would not be long before she got a response to the message she had sent. Her husband was a man of few words, but when he acted, things moved fast. She had never needed to ask him for much, but he had always made it clear. If she ever needed him, all she had to do was say the word. A few rows ahead, the businessman who had spoken up earlier leaned back in his seat, adjusting his cufflinks. His name was Daniel Grayson, a long-time executive in the airline industry. He had spent years in boardrooms discussing policies, profits, and passenger experience. And right now, he was watching a situation unfold that he knew would not end. Well, for that flight attendant, he had seen arrogance before. He had seen people in positions of minor power wield it like a weapon, convinced that they could get away with anything. But what he had just witnessed was not only unprofessional, it was a career-ending mistake. And the way the elderly woman had reacted with quiet patience and dignity told him everything he needed to know. She was not someone to be taken lightly. Meanwhile, the woman in the aisle seat, the one who had spoken up, kept glancing toward the elderly woman. She wanted to say something, to offer support, but she hesitated. Would it come off as pity? Would it make things worse? Finally, she leaned slightly toward her and whispered, "Are you okay?" The elderly woman turned her head slowly and gave her a small, knowing smile. "I've been through worse, dear." The woman nodded, but she could not shake the uneasy feeling in her chest. Up at the front of the cabin, the flight attendant was pacing near the galley, her fingers gripping the edges of a drink tray. Her heart was pounding, but she kept her expression neutral as she pretended to go about her duties. She had not meant to let things go this far. It had just happened. The frustration, the impatience, it had all boiled over in that moment. And now she could feel the weight of her mistake settling in. She stole a glance toward the elderly woman's seat. The way the other passengers were reacting, the way they were whispering, it made her uneasy. But she pushed the thought aside. It would blow over. People had short memories. By the time the plane landed, they would all move on, or so she thought. The elderly woman's phone buzzed in her lap. A simple vibration, discreet, almost unnoticed in the quiet cabin. She picked it up, turned it over, and read the message. "We are handling it." That was all it said. No anger, no theatrics, just quiet, certain action. She placed the phone back down, folded her hands neatly, and looked out the window again. The sky was clear, endless, stretching far beyond what the eye could see. Somewhere, far from this plane, a phone call was being made. A name was being passed along. A decision was being set into motion, and by the time they landed, everything would be different.